Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfic. This will be the continuation of Yuuei Survival Guide. This will be Part 20, Chapter 20. After Obero's birthday, everything settles out again. Sunday comes and goes, and his guardians are back to normal. They're maybe a bit quieter, a bit more soft-spoken, but besides that, they're almost completely back to normal. By Monday, you'd never be able to tell that they'd spent the weekend mourning a close friend's birthday. Izuku wonders briefly how his guardians would have been had Obero's 31st birthday fallen on a school day. He assumes it has before. It's the 5th, it can't fall on the weekends every year, right? He can't really imagine them staying home for the day, but also he can't really imagine them showing up in as poor moods as they've been in on that Saturday morning before. Izuku had guided mourning into something a little lighter. He pities the classes who would have been stuck with Shota's short, grieving temper over the years. He hands out suicide sprints and lectures on the best of days. Izuku doesn't want to imagine Shota on the worst of days. But that doesn't really matter now anyways. The day had passed, and with it, so had their dour moods and sad thoughts, and Izuku thinks that the cake and light atmosphere as opposed to the usual quiet morning may have helped. Hisashi had been up and gone before Izuku had even rolled out of bed, Obero tagging along with him, and Shota had been flopped on the couch with a mug of steaming coffee set on the coffee table when he'd finally shuffled out of his room. Izuku had been up early enough to make himself and his guardian's eggs. Nothing extravagant, but he could make decent scrambled eggs, as eggs were one of the things that he could sometimes find in the fridge going up. He plated it up with toast and set the 2 plates on the table. He's not sure why he's so awkward when it comes to inviting his guardians to eat with him. Once again, he knows that the worst that'll happen would be Shota declining the offer. Like when he'd been offering tea to his guardians, he lingers in the doorway and tries to find his voice. He hopes at some point they won't make him quite as nervous, but this is all still pretty new, and they're all just starting to understand each other. He shouldn't have been nervous. Izuku's coming to realize after the second time he'd worried over nothing when it comes to asking his guardians things. Shota pushes himself up with an arched eyebrow, when disturbed before his eyebrows knit together at the stumbled-over invitation, and he finally stands up and grabs his mug off the coffee table. Izuku will never admit the warm feeling of pride as he sees Aizawa-sensei, stern and rough around the edges, eating and enjoying something he made. He gets a gruff compliment as his teacher pauses his eating to sip at his coffee, which is when he points out that Izuku hadn't touched his meal yet, and the boy yelps and shovels a forkful of eggs into his mouth, much to his guardian's amusement. They arrive at the school together, and the 2 of them usually would, early enough that Shota leads Izuku into the teacher's lounge until more students arrive. Hisashi is there, already hunched over what looks like English homework from Friday, which reminds Izuku that, oh yeah, he hadn't finished this English homework because he'd been too sidetracked with the ghost's birthday and his out-of-character guardians. Thankfully, Hisashi is more than happy to help him with those last couple concepts that he'd struggle with. The voice hero multitasks like an expert, and he guides the team through concepts as he marks through their work. Slowly, teachers start filling the room. None seem too surprised to find Izuku sharing the space of Hisashi's desk, as a chair pushed up so they can both work at the small surface area. Namuri bounds over to ruffle Izuku's hair and drapes over Hisashi's shoulder to watch him mark. Shota just snorts a huff of laughter as Hisashi whines in annoyance at the surprise weight suddenly on him, not to mention Namuri pointing out things on the paper despite how, according to his guardians, she's awful at English. Second in the awful scale, just a snipe. A couple teachers look in their direction, but by the way no one is surprised at the interaction, he assumes this is a common occurrence. Izuku doesn't linger long when it starts to get closer to the time his peers would be arriving. He doesn't want to be seen leaving the teacher's lounge. He doesn't want his friends to think he's in trouble or worse, think that he's not, and he's just spending time with the teachers like a weirdo or a suck-up. And he doesn't really want anyone to start thinking that he's getting special treatment, because that's just not true, but he has no idea how he'd explain it if his classmates did see it. It's early enough that he's still one of the first ones in the class, followed by a ghost who is animatedly telling Izuku about Hisashi's patrol that morning and the villain that the voice hero had caught. Izuku listens half-heartedly as he finishes up the rest of the English homework, so it's ready for Hisashi's class. One by one his peers enter the room, most greeting Izuku with waves and smiles before settling at their own desks until their friends arrive, or crowding around their friends' desks as they come in. Uraraka bounds to Izuku's desk when she comes in, followed by a tense Ida. Izuku wants to ask Ida about the tension, how his jaw is clenched shut like he's trying to compose himself, but Obero just sends the teenager a sympathetic look, which reminds the green-haired boy that Ida's brother was in the hospital. That was why Ingenium hadn't been able to come around to celebrate Obero's birthday, like his guardians had mentioned they did every year. Izuku wants to express his sympathy too. He wants to be there for Ida and have his friend know that he's there for support if he needs it. But he also doesn't want to call Ida out right now. He doesn't know who, if anyone in class, knows about Ida Tensei being hospitalized due to the hero killer. And he also doesn't know how he'd explain his own knowledge of the situation apart from, oh, we were celebrating a ghost Shirokuma Obero, if you know him, his birthday, and my foster parents, Shota and Hisashi, or our senseis, mentioned that your brother was supposed to be there too, but couldn't make it because he's currently in the hospital dealing with substantial and potentially career-ending injuries. I'm sorry to hear your brother almost died at Stain's hands. Yeah, no, he was not going to do that. He'd feign ignorance and offer his sympathy in a support of some other type of way, preferably a way that didn't need a direct explanation that Izuku definitely did not want to give. Izuku doesn't have long to figure out a way to broach the subject of support with Ida, because soon the bell is ringing, and no more than a second later Shota is rolling the door open and stepping into the room. It feels like when Izuku blinks, everyone is in their rightful seats, staring wide-eyed at their sensei and awaiting his words at Shota's dark eyes as they survey over the room. Shota doesn't beat around the bush, eyes sharpening as he strides to his podium, speaking before he even reaches it and sets his papers down. We've been talking a bit about the upcoming draft internships. As most of you know, pros typically draft second or third-year students as interns, but after your performances at the festival this year, some pros and agencies have taken interest in a few of your potentials. Shota goes on, talking about the results of the pro-hero drafting, listing how many offers students got, mostly the ranking students who got dozens, if not hundreds of offers. It's no surprise to Izuku that Todoroki, Tokiyami, and Kachan received the highest amounts of offers, but Obero still lets out a low whistle as he glares at Kachan, who in turn is glaring at Aizawa-sensei. Their teacher talks of how everyone has the right to participate in an internship, whether they were drafted and offered positions or if they'll be taken on by agencies that agreed to take on students who didn't get any offers. Students who did not receive offers will choose from a list of the aforementioned pros, offering internships to anyone without, while those of you who received offers will choose from among your draft nominations. The internships will last 1 week, and you'll have just 2 days to choose your desired hero agency, so use your time wisely. When Shota was done speaking, he gets to work handing out lists of agencies, some of the offers from interested parties and others just a list of agencies and pros willing to take in any students. Some students wind up with one of each, like Izuku. He has some offers, a couple interested pros willing to take him and his destructive quirk on, but there's still not enough variety between pros and agencies, so Aizawa-sensei settles a list of the aforementioned agencies as well. Hisashi put in an offer for him, but that one for some reason feels a bit like a pity offer. Izuku's eyes narrow on the name Gran Torino, who he's never even heard of before, which is surprising because Izuku knows a lot of heroes. Who is that? Obero is leaning on the back of Izuku's chair, scanning over the names just as the green-haired teen is. Izuku lifts his shoulder in a silent, half-hearted shrug as an answer. I've never heard of that name before. Izuku bites the inside of his cheek as he narrows his eyes at the name, before promptly switching to the second paper he'd been given. He surveys over the pros and agencies most familiar to him. He's curious about this pro and who he's never heard of before, though. Maybe someone else will know. Gran Torino? Hisashi cocks an eyebrow, leaning back against the couch as he runs his fingers through his hair. He'd just gotten out of the shower, washing all the hair that he had gelled up and keeping his present mic hairstyle together. I've never heard of him. I hadn't either, Shota confesses, and he joins them in the living room from the kitchen. The scent of freshly brewed coffee fills the room, and Izuku knows the dark-haired man is caffeinating, so he's prepared for his patrol that night. The underground hero walks in, one hand clutching a mug of steaming coffee, and the other holding a curled-up Nemo in the bend of his arm. He plops down gracefully on the other side of the couch from Hisashi, kicking his legs up to drop them into Hisashi's lap. The blonde hardly reacts, just settles his hands on Shota's shins and keeps his eyes on Izuku. Shota takes a sip of his coffee before his own gaze is settling on the teen, head angling as he continues. He's retired. Apparently he taught at Yuuei years ago. Way before we attended. He did? Izuku cocks his head, tucking his feet under himself. He nurses his bottle of water in his hands, shooting a short look at the ghost that's perched on the armrest beside him. Obero was looking between the three of them, actually following the conversation, but making no move to be a part of it. This guy must be ancient, then. Hisashi blinks. I've still never heard of him. How long did he teach? Shota's lips pucker slightly, like he'd eaten a slice of lemon. 1 year. 1 year? Hisashi sputters in surprise. Why only a year? Was it on his terms, or was he fired or something? Shota shrugs, sipping at his coffee thoughtfully. Not sure. I tried to dig some information up, but considering the school year that he taught predates Nezu even teaching at the school, there wasn't a lot of sources. There isn't even much about him as a pro. He wasn't a limelight hero, and as far as I know, he also was an underground hero either. If there weren't copies of his license on file, I wouldn't have even believed he was the pro hero at all. Why is he interested in me? Izuku blinks, frowning between his teachers. I'm wondering the same thing. Shota huffs out, stroking Nemo's head. It's just strange that this retired pro is willing to come out of hiding and offer you an internship. There's been no word of him since this single year that he was teaching at Yuuei. Nothing reported on his hero name either, since he's in retirement. And we're sure we can trust him? Hisashi's voice is quiet and thoughtful, deep in that thought kind of quiet. There has to be a reason he only taught for a year. What if he was fired for misconduct or something? You want us to ship our kid off to a strange retired pro hero for a week? I looked. Shota shrugs, nothing of termination that would have been documented, no matter who this pro is he left on his own account after the year had finished up. If he had been fired, he would have never made it onto Izuku's nomination list. Who do you take me for, Zashi? Sorry. The blonde shakes his head with a light, apologetic smile. Shota rolls his eyes at Hisashi's half-hearted apology, digging his heels into the blonde's thigh. Hisashi huffs a light laugh, and he gently massages Shota's ankles and shins in a prolonged apology. The blonde's gaze casts over to Izuku in silent question as his fingers move. What do you think, Izuku? Well, I'm curious. The teen shifts where he's sitting. There has to be a reason he's interested in me. He didn't draft anyone else in class, and we talked about all our offers and where we were interested in going over lunch. No, he didn't. Shota agrees quietly, having gone through all the paperwork first. But that said, there's no reason this internship offer isn't viable. There's no reason for me to veto the offer, hence why it made it onto the list, so the choice of whether you want to take it is entirely yours. I don't know. Izuku mulls it over, the pad of his thumb swiping over the rim of his water bottle. It's just weird that I've never heard of him, you know. I've always loved heroes and studied them relentlessly growing up. I love seeing new ones and learning of the old ones and studying their quirks. It's kind of my hobby, but no one's heard of me included. I don't know. Izuku thinks for a second longer, thoughts drifting to All Might. He knows he should run the internship options past him and see what he thinks. All Might may not be around a lot to really help with the quirk, but he does know a lot of pros, and he probably knows good places to intern that could possibly help him when it comes to One for All. And who knows, All Might may even know this Gran Torino guy or something. You still have until the end of the day tomorrow to decide. Shota nods his head, gaze watching the teen as well. Don't rush the decision, Hisashi adds. But don't let your curiosity hinder your decision. Pick the internship that you think will be best for you. I will. As it turns out, All Might does know of Gran Torino. You know how I mentioned having a couple of mentors? The hero rubs awkwardly at the back of his neck, sounding the most nervous Izuku thinks he's ever heard him. The pro looks tense as he leads the teen through the hallway and into the teacher's lounge. Izuku gives a slow nod as he tries to keep up with All Might's quick, almost scared steps. Well, Gran Torino was one of them. He was? Izuku squawks, tripping over his own feet as he follows All Might into one of the conference rooms in the teacher's lounge. He was your mentor? One of them, All Might mumbles sheepishly. But he was a teacher here, Izuku mumbles out before he can even think it through. Logically, he knows All Might graduated from Yuuei. That had been what made Yuuei High School such a sought-after school in recent years. The #1 hero graduating from there? Every hero wannabe wanted to go to school where the best of the best attended. Still, Izuku can't help but recoil slightly at the knowledge. He goes to school where not only Present Mic and Eraserhead attended, but All Might too. What is his life? Yes, All Might sighs. He was. After my first mentor, the 7th wielder of One for All, passed on, Gran Torino stepped up in her place as my mentor. He'd aided her a little bit when it came to mentoring me, knew of the quirk from her, one of the few people to know the full story without possessing the quirk himself. I really don't know how he managed to do it, but when my 3rd year rolled around, he was my homeroom sensei. He became a teacher just to teach you? Izuku blinks in surprise. That was some dedication. Izuku can only imagine what a pro would need to do to be able to teach at a high school like Yuuei, and to go through the process for one class, one student, was incredibly surprising. I believe so, young Midoriya. All Might clears his throat like he's trying to swallow down a lump of nerves. It was a brutal year between my classes, internships, and his intense training. And he wants to train me? Izuku asks in bewilderment. Why? I assume it's the same reason he thought of training me. All Might shakes his head, interlacing his fingers together before settling them in his lap like a scolded schoolboy. He knows about One for All, and he does know how it's passed from holder to holder. How does he even know about me? At this, All Might shrugs helplessly. Perhaps the sports festival? If he watched that, then he would have seen that you're not quite up to his standards. He's known 2 generations of One for All holders now, so he'd know the quirk if he saw it, which would mean that I'm failing you as a mentor. Sheer fear settles on the pro's face and clouds his eyes like he's seconds away from being smited by God himself. How scary is this mentor? That means he would have seen me getting injured by One for All. Izuku winces. It really wasn't his proudest moment, letting Todoroki and his own superpowered quirk break him to the point that he needed surgery to right the wrong. Yes, All Might winces. I'd bet that's why he put in the internship offer. Izuku is silent as he lets that sink in. Then he's looking up towards his quiet mentor. Should I take it? All Might shifts uncertainly, like he'd been expecting the question, had thought about an answer, but still had no idea how to respond despite it. He opens his mouth only to close it and frown. Finally, the man lets out a slow sigh. I'll admit. All Might starts off slowly. It has been quite a few years since I've spoken to him, and he has a tendency to be a bit of a harsh teacher. But he was a good mentor. I learned a lot from him in the years I studied under him, and despite never possessing One for All, he's got a pretty good handle on it from watching Nana and myself. Izuku thinks back to how All Might had talked about his mentors back at the USJ incident, when he'd had to tell the pro that he almost accidentally spilled the secret of One for All to his sensei. Aizawa has been helpful for you, I know that. I've seen the subtle changes in how you wield the quirk, due to his teachings, but Gran Torino has more knowledge on it, and I don't doubt that he'll help you along just as he did for me. It won't be easy, mind you. He has a tendency to be brutal, my boy, but he knows what he's talking about. Izuku sucks in a breath, mouth flattening into a straight line. That afternoon, Izuku passes Shota the internship document that's finished. The only thing the slip of paper is missing is the guardian's signature. Izuku watches as Shota's eyes scan over the paperwork before catching on the chosen pro-agency line. His attention lifts up to Izuku, mouth pressed into a straight line, but a silent question flickering in his gaze. You're sure? Shota asks quietly under his breath so the rest of the class won't hear. Izuku gives a serious nod, dropping his gaze to his shoes. Shota lets out a heavy sigh, one eyebrow arching as he scribbles his signature on the bottom and files it away with the rest of his classes. Take your seat. They pick hero names that class. Shota had given them a casual warning the day prior, telling them to think about it without really telling them to think about it. Still, most of his class is shocked when Midnight saunters in, tell them what the agenda is as if Shota hadn't mentioned it yesterday. Shota promptly tucks away for a nap, leaving the class in her hands. Izuku can tell that Shota isn't completely asleep, more resting his eyes as he listens in. He'd picked up on when his guardian is actually asleep, and feigning it in the time that he'd been living with them. There are subtle tells. Izuku's not quite sure why he settles on the name Deku. For years he'd hated that stupid nickname. It made him feel awful and worthless, useless, as intended when Kacchan had doled it out years ago. But it was also a part of him, a bit of a reminder, why he needed to be better, do better. He never wanted to feel like he had growing up again. And then there was the fact that the nickname had slowly started to change since starting at Yuuei. Uraraka calling him by it in no way meant to belittle him, and after she had, some of his other classmates had as well, and suddenly it felt different. No one here knew the origin of the nickname. And even that little bit of confirmation from Kacchan that it was a stupid nickname like Kacchan was to the ashen-haired teenager had taken away some of the heat and hatred when thinking of it. It's not a particularly nice nickname, nor will it ever really be, considering what it means and where it came from, but Izuku does settle on it as his hero name. He knows that Shota definitely doesn't agree with his choice, even if Midnight wrinkles her nose a bit but accepts it, nonetheless. Izuku can tell by the way his guardian's lips twitch downwards, though, through his feigned sleep when Izuku announces his decision, but he doesn't back down. Deku it is. Perched on Izuku's desk, Oboro huffs out a breath of fond acceptance, also not particularly happy with Izuku naming himself useless, but the ghost shoots him a small smile even as he rolls his eyes. Before Izuku knows it, he's arriving at the address Gran Torino had given him. All Might hadn't been kidding when he'd said that this old man could be brutal. Not even in the way that he taught, but in the way he jested as well. It was a little cruel to play dead, like an opossum or something, right before his new protege arrives, laid out on the floor like he'd been murdered. Izuku's heart lurches into his throat, and he's sure that his heart rate doesn't drop that entire first day he's with his new mentor. He really does have Izuku fooled when he arrives in for the internship. Izuku should have known that he was in for one hell of an internship just by how he'd met Gran Torino. The little old man in the yellow hero costume appears to be senile. The man calls him Toshinori, All Might's given name, like he's back mentoring the #1 hero instead of Izuku. He plays the part perfectly, and Izuku is fooled. Izuku quickly realizes that it's just a facade. Gran Torino is messing with him. How Gran Torino teaches is kind of brutal as well. He'd psyched himself up for much worse, considering how All Might had all but cowered when Izuku had mentioned the retired pro's name. It was no walk in the park. Izuku gets thrown around, tossed into walls, and slammed into the floor by a tiny man who's easily in his 80s. The retired pro is fast. Izuku would love to pick apart the man's quirk, but for now all he can focus on is not getting his ass handed to him by an elderly man whipping around the room. He does learn. It takes just 2 days of working with his new mentor for Izuku to be able to channel One for All throughout his whole body instead of directing it towards any specific part when he intends to use it. He hears whispers in the back of his mind praising him. He tries not to get distracted by it, but it's odd, strange in a way that he's never felt before, which says something considering that he's seen ghosts for as long as he can remember. He's seen and heard ghosts, but he's never seen or heard them within himself. He tries not to let his thoughts catch on the fact that these voices he's faintly hearing in the depth of his brain are probably those of the past One for All wielders. Neither he nor All Might really knew what was going on with the quirk, besides the fact that, yes, those several figures behind All Might during the sports festival were probably the 7 previous wielders. He'd brought up what he'd seen during his battle with Shinso to the pro that Monday after the festival, and All Might had gone surprisingly quiet as he'd thought. Though not exactly like Izuku, nowhere near as prominent, the pro had also mentioned hearing and seeing similar things when he possessed the full power of One for All. All Might does admit that the quirk is haunted, but of it he doesn't know much considering it never showed itself to him, and neither his mentor Nana or Gran Torino had ever spoken of it. It matched up too well for it to be anything else, but still, All Might seemed confused that Izuku had physically seen them, when All Might himself had just heard whispers and visualized shapes of almost resembling people. Izuku can't help but wonder if it's because of the other quirk that they're all so human in appearance, that they had physical forms outside of the quirk, stood behind All Might, and that they talked to him more than they'd talk to anyone else. He'd dwell on that later, when he's not in near constant threat of being slammed into the floor or the wall. Izuku trains hard, fights Gran Torino to the best of his abilities, and starts to feel almost confident in his growing abilities. There's still a lot of work to be done. He can hardly even touch the jet-quirked man, but he's grown a lot just since arriving for his week internship. He can't wait to show Shota how much he'd learned on their next quirk training session, or even during class. During this internship, Izuku also has the added distraction of a ghost who decides, since he can't be of any use around the retired pro, that he'll add commentary that just Izuku can hear. Izuku gets really tired of hearing, "And he's down," and "Looks like our favorite green bean has been taking another hit now by the ancient hero," and worst of all, "Wow, that'll definitely leave a bruise." Very fast. He supposes it's a good lesson when it comes to focus. He needs to focus on Gran Torino's quick movements and not the ghost's irritating voice and words. After a couple hard hits when he's distracted, Izuku starts getting better at tuning his friend out and focusing on the threat. He knows Oboro's just trying to be annoying, but it actually does help his focus, and he can now easily ignore the ghost. Probably not what Oboro had in mind when he came close to annoying Izuku, but Izuku thinks it's very beneficial of a lesson. When things do get intense, though, when Izuku gets worked up or things get a bit too rough, the ghost does know when to keep quiet. He asks if Izuku's all right, and he lets his tone take the concerned curl that it usually does. And at night, when Gran Torino is passed out, the ghost is very sympathetic and understanding of just how brutal the training is. It's painful, and Izuku knows that he's going to leave this internship bruised like an old banana. So Izuku's not really mad about the ghost's presence, just a bit annoyed. Despite how brutal it is, Izuku knows he's learning, though. He can feel himself getting better with the quirk, which is why he begs for Gran Torino to keep attacking, pleads for the man to just a few more minutes. Izuku knows that he'll land a hit on the pro at some point. He just needs to keep practicing. But like Shota, the man cuts him off when he deems Izuku has had enough for the day. Or maybe the pro just really likes his early evening bedtimes. In the evening of the third day of the internship, that Gran Torino decides him ready to go on an actual patrol, or maybe he just wants to switch things up from the cat-and-mouse game that Izuku had been losing horribly at. The teen is surprisingly nervous as he changes into his hero costume. It's the first time he's sought out villains, instead of coming face-to-face with them during a school activity or being cornered by them on his walk home from school. He's nervous on the taxi ride to the train station, but he's anxious by the time they board the train, taking them to Shinjuku. And then shit hits the fan. The Nomu's attack. The train is destroyed and Gran Torino leaps into action, and Izuku can't just sit there and wait. He's a heroics course student. He's here on his internship to learn how to help people. What good is he just sitting in a damaged train waiting for someone else to come rescue them when he can be helping? He knows he needs to locate Gran Torino. He doesn't doubt the pro's ability, but Gran Torino is kind of old and retired, and Izuku knows he should have stuck close to him. Izuku is the man's responsibility, after all, even if the pro demanded he stay in the train car. Oboro is at his side as Izuku traverses the city easily, falling back on everything Aizawa-sensei had been teaching them in class. His recently learned full cowl makes it so much easier to do so, and Izuku almost feels like he's flying as he jumps from rooftop to rooftop. When he arrives at the center of the chaos, he's almost instantly distracted by a call of Ida's name. There are pros talking about his friend, his missing friend, apparently. It's unlike Ida to go AWOL. That's when a bad feeling churns in his stomach. He knows Ida has been off since his brother was attacked, but he's never suspected Ida to be dumb enough to go off alone in search of the hero killer. He hoped he was wrong, and that his feeling was nothing, but that's not the case. Izuku's not entirely sure how he finds Ida, in Stain's hands no less, but he does. And he knows he can't leave his friend to fend for himself. He's torn between finding his mentor and helping his friend, and obviously helping his friend wins out. It's hardly a thought. He's moving before he realizes it, and it's even Ida, on the ground with the murderer taking out heroes left and right, standing over his prone form. And the fight begins. It's grueling. Stain is a hard opponent. He's smart, has a very useful quirk. He'd taken out dozens of heroes, and Izuku knows that they're just students. Ida had walked into this fight with nothing but vengeance on his mind, and that's not what they're supposed to be. Izuku's not surprised when he finds himself locked under Stain's quirk, body paralyzed no matter what he does. He's not surprised, but he's so incredibly frustrated with himself that it's not funny. He's faintly reminded of his battle against Shinso, but this is 100 times worse. Oboro is loudly panicking at Izuku's side, like he doesn't know what to do. Izuku can't open his mouth to speak, as he barely has control of his eyes. Izuku's breathing picks up as Stain eyes him. The man is talking, preaching, really, but it's in one ear and out the other as he sinks himself over to Ida, clearly ready to end what he started. Izuku could cry when he spots Todoroki. He hardly remembers shooting off the text to all of his contacts. It's been nothing more than a location drop and sheer hope that his classmates would see through the rushed and panicked message and come help. A shot of fire blocks Stain from reaching Ida, followed by ice crystallizing along the ground and sweeping everyone behind Todoroki. He can just watch as Todoroki fights the villain one-on-one. Izuku's not sure what forces him out of the paralysis. Maybe it's Oboro shaking him by the shoulder and urging him up, or the quirk wearing off, but as soon as he feels it, he's up and aiding Todoroki. Oboro's trying his best, using himself as a distraction. He throws it himself, literally, through the hero killer as he had the villain at the USJ, but it doesn't seem to faze the villain at all. Todoroki is using his ice, his more trained side, and Izuku feels the chill of it sinking into his bones as he fights. The second time Izuku feels paralysis sink into his bones, Oboro is at his side in a second. The ghost had dropped to his knees beside Izuku, hands hovering uselessly. "Fuck, are you okay?" No, he's not. Do it, Izuku forces out. Save Native and Ida. Protect them. Help Todoroki. A look of determination clashes over Oboro's face as he gives a hard nod. His hand reaches out ready to grasp Izuku's arm, but it goes through. Oboro lets out a gasp as he wavers forward, clearly expecting to make contact. Izuku opens his mouth to share the surprise, except a feeling of cold rushes through his body. He wants to cry out, but no words will come. He's so cold it's almost painful. Todoroki's attacks vary between ice and fire, throwing each element easily and blocking Stain away from Ida and Native, but Izuku can see him getting tired. He sees him getting overwhelmed. Todoroki's still unused to using his fire, but he does so without a second thought. The fire spreads warmth through the alley, but the ice rushes Izuku's veins. He can't move, and the ground is so cold. He's so cold. He's never felt like this before. It feels like his blood is seconds away from freezing. It hurts. The only saving grace is those bursts of warmth. Without them, Izuku feels like he would have frozen to death. His body eases out of the paralysis slowly, and his body's first response is to get up despite how his body wobbles and his limbs feel uncoordinated. Oboro is at his side as he pushes himself up, hand phasing through him again as if the first failed attempt at using Izuku's quirk was a fluke. The chill that crawls up his shoulders where the ghost had attempted to touch him makes a cry of pain burst from his mouth. It's never happened before. Oboro is always cold, but it just feels like the ghost is jabbing an icicle through his shoulder. He hears himself mumbling out apologies and slurred reassurances, but it doesn't look like it helps. He's never seen Oboro jump away from him so fast. "I'm sorry," the ghost wheezes out. I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening. I don't know how to help. I'm so sorry." Izuku can't focus on the ghost, not with his classmates struggling to survive and a wounded pro relying on them. When Izuku finally managed to focus his attention on his friends, Ida had joined the fight again. It seems Todoroki had gotten through to him. His attacks are slower, even with full cowl. The chill in his body makes his limbs heavy and tense. He's never felt like this before. Never been so cold. But he can't give up. He can't, and he won't. He'll keep going until he literally can't anymore. It takes the three of them together to finally defeat Stain. Izuku is still so cold as they restrain the hero killer. He feels his body shiver, slipping a little on the frosted ground. It's not even really cold outside. It's a nice night, but his body doesn't seem to agree. His teeth chatter the faintest bit, and the shivers are slowly getting worse. He can't help but push up against Todoroki's fireside as they all work together to get both Stain and Native out of the alley and onto the street so they're spotted when the help finally arrives. "I'd like to apologize." Ida bows his head before looking up between his friends. He says more, talks for a while, but Izuku can't seem to force himself to focus. He thinks Ida might be crying through the apology. He says something about selfishness, and the words are just gone from Izuku's brain as fast as he hears it. His brain feels funny. His everything feels funny, actually. He's so cold still, wavering against his classmate's side. "Midoriya?" Todoroki turns his head lightly, eyebrows furrowing when he spots the other team shivering. "You're freezing." Izuku squeezes his eyes shut, tongue feeling heavy in his mouth. His energy is very quickly abandoning him. It feels like his energy is being drained out and replaced with snapping cold that tears at his body. He can't find it in himself to reply. Can hardly make his mouth even open as he slurs out a few syllables. "Midoriya?" Ida questions, one hand putting pressure on his own shoulder wound while the other keeps a hold of Stain. "Are you all right?" "He's so cold." Todoroki frowns, lifting his arm to wrap around Izuku's shoulder and actually tug him into his side. Izuku feels the warmth spread along his side, but he can't seem to stop the shivers. "Your heart rate is very slow." Izuku hadn't even noticed Todoroki's fingers pressed against the pulse point in his neck. "You're not looking too good," Oboro whispers from the other side of the sidewalk. He'd made sure to keep his distance, and this is the second failed attempt at channeling Izuku's quirk. A small part of Izuku feels bad the ghost is so afraid to get close to him, but the bigger part is melting into the warmth of his classmate. "I didn't hit you with my ice, did I?" Todoroki sounds off. Izuku hears the consternation in his classmate's voice at just the thought of accidentally injuring someone with his quirk. No," Izuku manages to spit out, the words coming out slurred. Cold." "It's not cold, Midoriya." Ida sounds so concerned. "This is not normal." "No," Todoroki agrees quietly. "It's not." "He needs help." Izuku feels Todoroki nod slowly in agreement. "I'm so sorry," Oboro whispers dejectedly, and Izuku wants to tell him it's not his fault, because it's not. Oboro touches him all the time, and he's never felt like this. He doesn't know what's happening. "I don't know what happened. What's so different this time? Why did I do that to you?" The pros arrive in a flurry of questions and concern. Gran Torino gives Izuku a look before moving to his side and eyeing him. He must not look great because his mentor frowns heavily. He touches Izuku's arm, and the frown deepens when he does. What happened to him? Izuku's having a hard time keeping himself up, and if it wasn't for Todoroki, he'd probably have sprawled across the pavement by now. He can't seem to regulate his temperature, even with Todoroki's help. We're not sure, Todoroki responds steadily. I might have accidentally hit him with my quirk. No, Izuku denies instantly. Didn't. Ambulances are on the way, one of the pros tells them calmly, and Izuku has half a mind to pull away from Todoroki in order to look at the gathering pro of heroes. He doesn't realize he's actually pulling away until he almost hits the ground, except before he does, something grabs him. He cries out as something sharp pierces through the cold haze, pierces into his body. It stings, grasping at him, and he feels wind on his face. Cold, cold wind. He hears voices behind him, calls of his name. Oboro shouts and Gran Torino yells. Todoroki and Ida call his name in a panic, but all he can focus on is the fact that something has him. And then he's falling. Izuku doesn't remember crashing to the ground, but he sees Stain and he sees the Nomu who had taken him. He feels his head is full of cotton, and he's trying to grasp at consciousness, but it feels like a losing battle. The last thing he remembers is seeing Oboro instantly at his side, hands hovering over Izuku, almost afraid to touch him, his friends rushing towards him, followed only a couple of steps behind by the pros. Shota is on patrol when he gets the message. It's a bit of a slow night. He feels the most awake he had since he's gotten the roster of his hell class. He'd been getting some sleep during the days, prepared for his nightly patrol. All of the teachers had been taking the lack of Class 1A and 1B in stride and using the free hours during the day for themselves, either as me time or to prep for the heroic student returns. Shota himself had used his free time to sleep. And it had been some of the best naps he'd ever taken at Yuuei. It's very nice to not have to be worried about his class lighting things on fire, starting fights, or attracting villains like villain magnets that they are. He hasn't heard anything from any of the agencies or pro-heroes who had taken his kids on, which is beyond great. That means nothing too dangerous has happened. No one's been hospitalized and he can rest easy. But of course, when does that ever happen when it comes to his class? He's perched on the top of a building when his phone vibrates in his pocket. Since it's slow, he slips it out and he looks. It's an emergency alert of a villain attack in Hosu, specifically a Nomu attack. It's come down through the police, asking any and all available pros to make their way to downtown Hosu. It's not unheard of for neighboring forces and pros to be asked to aid with rounding up villains, doing damage control and helping civilians. Plus, Shota knows that Nomu are not a joke. Just the thought of those monstrous creatures makes the scar on his cheek tingle. He reaches a hand up to brush along the mark, frowning when it doesn't stop the feeling. Hosu is only a train ride away, and he knows that he could get there fairly quickly. His patrol is pretty slow anyways. He'd be more use over there than he would here. He'll leave his patrol in the capable hands of the police. Shota hops across a couple of buildings on his way to the train station. He knows the city will be in chaos with the attacks, and as much as he knows what the heroes who patrol Hosu are capable of, he also wants to lend a hand. Plus, he knows for a fact that Ida's interning there, and he wants to make sure his student's all right. Thank God it's just one of his problem children in the center of the chaos over there. Shota hops across a couple more buildings before he feels his phone vibrate again. For just a second he ignores it, figuring that it's just an update from the automated police line connecting to his phone, the same line that had informed him of the attack. But then it vibrates a second time, and a third, a fourth, fifth, sixth, and Shota roughly drags his phone out of his pocket as the seventh vibration only to freeze. The messages are from Hisashi. Answer your phone. Shota, please. Please tell me you saw the text. Shota, please. Fuck, I'm calling. The messages came in rapid succession, none of them giving it even a second to respond, even if he had pulled his phone out instantly. He stares down at them in surprise, heart thumbing in his chest as he thinks about what could have riled his husband up enough that he loses the ability to spell. He's not thinking long because at the bottom of his notifications, the first message to come in that apparently was not from Hisashi like the rest, is a singular message from Izuku. And no, it's not even a message, it's a pinned location. A pinned location in Hosu. His foster child is in Hosu, where there's an infestation of Nomu, where the League of Villains is probably running rampant. There's now 2 of his kids in danger, and he's a whole city away. What the fuck? Shota hurries his pace, bounding to the next rooftop as his phone vibrates with an incoming call. He doesn't even need to look at the caller ID before he's pressing it to his ear, only to hear his husband in hysterics. He tries to calm Hisashi down, but That's a bit hard to do when he can hardly hear him over the sound of his own pounding heartbeat. All right, everyone, this concludes Chapter 20 of Yuuei Survival Guide. Chapter 21 will be next, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.